Good evening. My name is Susan Wargaftig. I am Vice President of the Lunt Neighborhood Action Group, which is the fiscal arm of the PIP. PIP meeting since official PIP meeting since 2022, February 2022, and now we're going to be doing them much more regularly, and we're going to get progress happening. We believe. What we're going to do is, I know I sent out the agenda to folks. What we'd like to do is do the first section for about 25 minutes or so, have some questions after that, do the next steps section and have questions after that, and then do the funding update with some questions and next meetings. So we're going to try to move this through fairly quickly and clearly, and we have some lovely slides to make it all seem pretty and exciting. So Glenn, do you want to start out with the slides?
Yes, but I'm going to put a link to the slide deck in the chat, a PDF of the slides, so that anybody who wants to should be able to download that.
I will be sending them out to everyone on our list tomorrow morning.
Okay. So that's in the chat, and now I will share my screen. And
what we wanted to do is start out with kind of a review of where we've been, and Glenn's going to do that part of the presentation.
And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I have a tendency to get in the weeds. So this is the timeline going pretty far back, starting in 1902 when Lunt first opened. And if you can see the timeline, we're going to take it all the way up to the present. So Lunt Silversmith opened on this particular location over 100 years ago. The use of TCE, trichloroethylene, became a common degreasing agent in the 1930s. I am not sure when that material started being used at the Lunt property. I'm not sure that those records exist, but you could probably figure sometime after 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It was in use pretty continuously. There were other solvents as well that were used, chlorinated solvents and other solvents, but the one that we're mostly concerned about is TCE. And in 2009, the Lunt company declared bankruptcy. Part of that process was that the city purchased the baseball fields to the west of the factory buildings, and the city paid $660,000 for that. Part of that money was used to pay the back taxes, but a big chunk of the money went to the owner, who then declared bankruptcy. And eventually the city became the proud owner of the property through a deed in lieu of foreclosure, because there were additional taxes owed on all of the buildings as well. I don't know the exact number. I've heard $500,000 in back taxes, but I don't know that we have anything that says exactly how much was owed. But the bankruptcy court essentially awarded this prize to the city. I'm not positive when the date was when TCE was first identified at the site. In the phase 1 environmental site assessment, there is mention of TCE from several people who were interviewed, people who worked for the city. And that was probably known back in 2010 But at least in 2012, it was acknowledged. That was when the process started. The contamination was reported to DEP. And there was also some indoor air quality testing done of the buildings that showed that there were vapors inside the buildings at the site. And then there was some air monitoring done in the neighborhood that showed that it was likely that indoor air quality was being impacted as well in some residences. The city got a lot of assistance from the EPA and the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. Got a number of grants to do surface cleanup. And from reading the documentation, they mostly removed heavy metals and dug down to the water table, but did not do any what's called dewatering so that they could dig down into the water table to continue to remove materials. So it was a superficial effort that was done. A lot of that material was removed off-site. I don't know how much of it was left on site. And this was all in preparation for redevelopment of the site was the goal. And then in 2015, a lease was signed with a developer called 401 Liberty Street. It's a limited liability corporation. And the lease said that 401 Liberty may not interfere with the remediation of the hazardous waste at the site. In 2016, the addiction treatment and detox facilities opened. They were pretty much immediately full. The beds were full. However, that opening was done before the indoor air quality was tested. So the buildings were occupied before the environmental testing was done. And they did discover at that time that there was TCE vapor intrusion into the indoor air. And so almost a year later, the Mass DEP issued an order to the city of Greenfield to install subslab depressurization systems to mitigate the TCE vapor intrusion into the buildings. It was considered to be an imminent hazard because of the levels of the TCE in the air. And remember, these were fully occupied buildings. So we jump up to 2020, and we have left out some things on this timeline, but in 2020, a phase 2 environmental a comprehensive site assessment was prepared by O'Reilly, Talbot, and Oken. And that was a consulting firm that was working for the tenant, the 401 Liberty tenant. And that phase 2 PSA, comprehensive site assessment, proposed leaving the TCE contamination on site as essentially proposed. The permanent solution would be just to leave everything as it is. And there was a theoretical, what's called the conceptual site model that alleged the TCE contamination was being removed by the storm drain system. And no idea where it was going after that, except that it was leaving the property in the storm drains. And they did test and found it in the storm drains. And they also tested the outfall from the city storm drain system, which goes into the Green River, and did not detect TCE in the outfall of the storm drains, which is about 1.5 miles away. So somewhere in between the Lunt property and the Green River, the TCE something's happening to it. I don't know how to explain it better than that. And then in 2021, former Mayor Wiedegartner came to the city council and asked that the city council approve the transfer of the ownership to the developer, because they had signed a lease option agreement that they could purchase the property after it was determined to be cleaned up. And they needed to get a letter of, I guess, sufficient cleanup letter from the DEP or the EPA. And that obviously didn't happen. The mayor wanted to record what's called an activities and use limitation, which is a deed restriction, essentially, saying that the property could never be used for residential housing because of the contamination. But that whole process never happened, because at that point, our current mayor, Mayor DeSorger, was city councilor, and she was very concerned about the lack of proper cleanup at the site. She started reading all of the documentation and figured out pretty quickly that the cleanup had not occurred. And as a result of that, the mayor, former mayor Wiedegartner, withdrew her request for a transfer of that property. Right around that time, or a little bit after, a number of people joined together to form the public involvement group. And that is a process under the Mass DEP's regulations, where any 10 citizens can petition to have a contaminated site designated as a public involvement plan site. So that happened in December of 2021. 36 residents signed that petition, submitted it to the city and to DEP, and that automatically triggered the designation of this site as a PIP site. Currently, there are more than 125 people, including at least 9 members of the city council, the current city council, and numerous former city council members who are also members of the PIP. It's a very large group. So after the PIP group formed, the mayor, former mayor, I should say former there, but the former mayor turned the entire process over to 401 Liberty, who held a meeting at which no city officials were present. And for most of us who were there, and it is recorded and you can watch it on GCTV, it was felt that the approach was very hostile. People were pretty tense about the way the meeting was handled. And this was a public hearing about the draft public involvement plan. And since that point, which was February of 22, no further PIP meetings have been called by the city or by the developer who was handed this PIP process by the former mayor. But as a result of the involvement of the citizens group, the PIP group, and you can see a picture of the protest that we held, the DEP determined that they would conduct an audit of the cleanup process. They did that, and they found that the comprehensive site assessment that had been done in 2020 was not comprehensive. It had a number of missing parts that are required by the regulations, such as determining the full extent of the contamination. And they issued a notice of non-compliance, but not to the developer, to the city, because the city is the owner by deed. And that started a process, and I'll continue on through. The city council passed a resolution expressing a lack of confidence in the licensed site professional and the company OTO, who had been working for the developer. And the city council and the PIP group tried to convince the former mayor to hire an independent LSP who is actually working for the interests of the city and not the interests of the developer, which may not be the same. And from public records request, it was determined that the city of Greenfield had not had an LSP working on its behalf or paying an LSP since the assessment process started in 2012. They had no records that the city had paid an LSP any money. Then a little later that year in 2022, the PIP group formed a nonprofit organization in order to apply for a technical assistance grant from the Mass DEP. And that group was awarded $20,000 to hire an independent LSP to help represent the interests of the community. And the group received the money, and Lyons Witten, who's on this meeting tonight, was hired as the independent LSP to give technical assistance to the PIP group and the residents of Greenfield. And the city, if the city wants to listen to an independent voice. And as a result of the audit, the DEP required that the city come up with a revised scope of work for what still needed to be done in order to consider the comprehensive site assessment to be completed. That's the phase 2 comprehensive site assessment. And that process of getting the scope of work approved, seemed to take about a year. So jumping up to last year, just a few months ago, former Councilor DeSorger was elected as the new mayor of Greenfield in a real upset landslide where almost 75% of the voters, I think it was 73% of the voters, voted for Ginny DeSorger over the incumbent, Roxanne Wiedegartner, which is a pretty amazing landslide. And looking at the news reports from that election, the Lunt contamination was mentioned in almost every article as one of the key issues, along with several other big issues in Greenfield, but it was mentioned in almost all of the newspaper articles. We're up to pretty much current time right now. In January of this year, Bruce Nicholson, who had been the LSP of record for the Lunt site, resigned as the LSP of record. My understanding is that he retired from OTO, the company where he worked. And during the preceding time, especially when we were asking the former mayor to hire an independent LSP, former Mayor Wiedegartner instead hired an attorney to supposedly monitor the PIP process or interact with the PIP group. Not sure. No one on the PIP group was ever contacted by the attorney, but that attorney billed the city about $45,000 for PIP work, PIP related work. And we really feel like that money should have been spent on an independent LSP. It seemed like that was a big waste of money. Considering that that person never held a PIP meeting, that attorney never held a PIP meeting, and that attorney also resigned from working with the city on January 2nd, the day that our new mayor was sworn in. So this is the first official PIP meeting. I suppose it technically is not an official meeting because just earlier this evening, the Board of Health accepted the mayor's request to become the city entity that implements the PIP plan. So technically, this would not be an official city meeting. It is listed on the city calendar as an event. But going forward, the PIP meetings will be kind of held and organized by the Greenfield Board of Health, which makes a lot of sense. I think it makes sense from a lot of different perspectives. And I think Susan indicated that we plan to have regular meetings. So the question is, where are we now? And I'm going to quickly go through the DEP has a rough timeline that they expect when sites are reported. They're then classified. There's an initial assessment done. And then this detailed site assessment would be what's called the phase 2 comprehensive site assessment. That's typically done by the third year. And then there's a cleanup plan that's developed and implemented. And the DEP timeline envisions that this entire process would take 6 years. Now, this is the Greenfield timeline. Remember, it really started probably back further in 2010. But for our discussion here, we're looking at a process that has been going on for 12 to 14 years. And we are now currently at the Greenfield site, at the Lunt site, we are currently essentially still stuck back in year 2 of this process that DEP envisions will take 6 years. So we've spent 12 to 14 years making 2 years of progress. Now, that's a little bit unfair characterization because there has been a lot of work done at the site. Cleanup work was done, and a lot of sampling has been done, and I think we'll talk about that. But as far as the DEP timeline goes, we are stuck in year 2, still working on preparing an adequate comprehensive site assessment phase 2 report. And the proposed timeline that was discussed in correspondence with DEP envisioned that comprehensive site assessment would not be completed until sometime toward the end of 2025. So that's where we're at. And I guess I can ask if, before we go there, are there any questions about this history, timeline, where we're at?
Glenn, can we leave so people can see, so we can see if people have raised hands or anything? Can we leave the presentation and just go back? There we go. Thank you. Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Norm?
Yes, is there any work that's been done to alleviate the air that people are breathing, the contaminated air in the buildings?
Yes, I can say that as a result of the order from DEP, there were 2 passive vapor mitigation systems put into the basements of 2 of the buildings. DEP ordered that I think four buildings get what are called sub-slab depressurization systems, which are like, I don't know if you're familiar with a radon abatement system. They put pipes under the slab and put a fan on it to depressurize, create a vacuum in the slab so that any vapors coming in under the building are vented out. Instead, this site, a couple of the buildings have passive systems that are not the preferred way of dealing with vapors in buildings, but that's what's there now. There has been some additional indoor air monitoring, and I don't want to get into the details, but so some of the buildings did have abatement work done in them or remediation done. I couldn't tell you if those systems are, adequate. I actually I'm not sure that they really have been looked at closely.
Other
Does that answer your
question?
question?
Yes, but is there any plans for much more aggressive remediation?
Well, that's what the PIP group is really here to discuss. Yeah.
Matt,
I know we've certainly brushed over and discussed this topic many times over the last couple of years, but accountability of the leadership, Weidergartner and the LSP that was in charge, is there any viable accountability for those folks in upholding the proper process? And I don't know how legal it is, Glenn, or if it's even worth our pursuing. I mean, the most important thing is to get it cleaned up, get people safe. But secondary to that would be accountability to folks who really should have been, who are hired to do the job professionally. Oh, and
yeah, I'm not familiar with what that process would be to get accountability. I think that, like you said, we really are focused on wanting to make sure that the safest site for all the patients there. And, from my training in public health and from a Board of Health perspective, we want to make sure that no one that is visiting that facility and no one in the neighborhood is exposed to hazardous waste at any level. I believe that if you go to a facility like this treatment facility, you should not be exposed to TCE vapors. And I understand that people can argue about how dangerous certain levels are and stuff like that. But I believe that this material has been banned for use. It is known to cause cancer and all kinds of other health impacts. And so I think that people should not be exposed to it, especially if there is a way to prevent that from happening. So that's where I come down on that. And I think that we need to work toward that. Zero exposure should be the goal. And that is the goal of the state program as well. The public should not be exposed to uncontrolled emissions of toxic materials.
Dorothy,
So I thought that the people that were in the rehab center were removed, but are there people living in that building now, a different group of people? Or what's happening there now?
I only know what I've read in the newspaper, and that was quite a few months ago. They removed all of the women from at least the first floor of the facility. And, I don't know what the conjecture, I don't know what the assumption is. My supposition is that they were concerned about potential exposure of women of childbearing age to TCE vapors, because These are a known teratogen or mutagen for pregnant women and can also impact the ovaries and permanently impact eggs through changes to DNA. So that's my conjecture. That's just an assumption, but suddenly all of the women were removed from this facility and put in a different location. But I don't, again, we have not been in close contact with the agencies that are running the rehab facility. Hopefully that'll be something that we can develop a better relationship with now that the city has taken over the PIP process going forward.
Thank you.
Matt?
I think there are still at least 20 or more folks living in the facility. And I only say that because I see large groups come out and go for walks regularly. I live across the street and, you know, engage with them at times just to say hello and meet my dogs. And, you know, they're gentle folks. And there's got to be at least 20 people living in the facility at this point, and maybe more. Those are the folks who are going out for walks. So,
yeah, what I know about the facility is that there are different cohorts of folks there. Some of them are in a program with the Franklin County Correctional process, where they're essentially in drug rehab, sort of in you know, a mini jail or something like that, as part of that rehab process. I don't know if those are men or women. I don't know any of those details. But then there are a couple of other components that are operational there as well. And, you know, I think it's up to us to find out more about that. Maybe ask for a meeting, a tour of the facility, so that we have a better understanding of, you know, who's involved, who is at risk of being exposed. And I think, this is my personal opinion, I think that we want that facility in Greenfield. I think it's a very critical public health facility. We don't want it closed down, because as long as it is there, I think it is very helpful for our argument that we need to make to get the funding to clean it up. And so, you know, I think at the same time, we want to make sure that the people who are staying there are staying in a place that is safe for them and that they're not being exposed to uncontrolled hazardous materials, vapors. So that's probably all I'll say about that. I think that we need to find out more about it.
If we don't have any more questions, I'd like to move on to kind of where we're going, because I think some of those questions will be answered in that process.
Great. I'll go back to sharing my screen.
And this section of the program is going to be led by Lyons Witten, who is our licensed site professional, and will give us a better sense of where things are and how we're moving forward. So I'm going to now leave that up to Lyons to make the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Glenn, can you advance the slide? Thank you. So O'Reilly, Talbot, and Oken did a number of sampling activities in January and February, perhaps earlier than that, replaced a number of monitoring wells that have been destroyed over time, added a few new ones, and I have taken their map, which you see here, and superimposed on it in red lettering in similar black boxes their results. They shared the results of their sampling in tabular form through an environmental monitoring report with the city, but did not include an updated map. So I took the tables of results and for groundwater sampling and added the new groundwater results to this map that had been previously published. So all the new results are in red lettering, so you can distinguish what's new on this. They sampled 3 wells up near, they installed 2 new monitoring wells up near Norwood Street, well F and well E, in areas F and E where the blue circles are. And they also sampled well LS10, which is up in that area. And all
Do you
of
want me to zoom into that?
sure. Great. So that's close enough. Thanks. So those are all at the top of your screen. And certainly monitoring well F and E, the results indicate that groundwater is clean. LS10 has a little bit of TCE. Oh, the other thing I should say is that the only contaminant mapped in this map is TCE. There are other contaminants at the site. And so the boxes that are highlighted in yellow are sample results where I noticed a significant amount of other chlorinated solvents. Mostly it was degradation products of the TCE, a dichloroethylene. Several of them have perchloroethylene. But anyway, so the ones that are highlighted in yellow have more contaminants of concern than just the TCE, but this map and the results shown on it are simply the TCE. So they did do some upgradient well installation and sampling. Well, LS10 hasn't been sampled in 12 years. The concentration went up a little bit, but I wouldn't say that's terribly significant. And MWF and E are clean. At MWA, they installed a pair of wells, and for the purposes of this discussion, we'll compare it to well LS24 because they're essentially all in the same spot. The pair of wells that were put in were a shallow and a deep well, screened at different elevations. MWA is a water table well, I presume. And the deep well is down at 25, 30 feet below grade. What you can see from this is that in LS24 in 2012 and 2013, we had rather high levels of TCE, 17, 18,000 ppb. And today, in January 24, the surface groundwater has a concentration of 61. And on the face of it, you go, wow, that's great. The concentrations went way down. And it is, that's good. When you look at the deep well, all of a sudden you can say, oh, well, that's where it went. Because chlorinated solvents are, as a class, they are all heavier than water. And so they sink in the water table. Takes time, but they do sink over time. And certainly in area A, it would appear that the near surface contamination has sunk in the water table and is at least 25, 30 feet below grade at a concentration of 10,000. So that brings up a couple of questions. This being the only deep well in this part of the map, the only deep well on the Lunt property per se, if you discount the ball field at this point. These results point to the need for a number of additional deep monitoring wells to figure out if the near surface contamination at other parts of the site, where it may or may not look like it's gotten better, whether it got better or not, did it sink? And if so, how deep did it go? And if it got down deep, then where did it go? Because it can get, chlorinated solvents can go down to a confining layer, say clay or something compact, or to a bedrock surface. And then if those surfaces are slightly tipped, they'll continue to go downhill and can migrate in a direction that isn't necessarily the direction of groundwater flow, which at this site has been determined to go from Norwood Street toward Kenwood Street. But that doesn't mean that contaminants in the TCE and in the deep MWA are flowing to the south. They could be going any which way. Also doesn't mean that they only go to 25, 30 feet, whatever I don't remember the exact depth of that well. It means they're at least that far. They could be deeper. So those are some questions that are raised by area A. You can see, if you sort of go over to the left, on the very left side, right above the words Kenwood Street, is well LS21. That well was apparently destroyed and a replacement was put in earlier this year. It was sampled on the 1st of February, and the result is 4.8 in the replacement well. That's not a particularly high number, but it's higher than non-detect, which is what that well had been 11 years earlier. So it would appear that the TCE is spreading slightly to the west. I wouldn't say that that's either shocking, alarming, or worrisome. It just is. And a site like this where contaminants sit for a long time, things are going to spread out. And the results in well LS21 are showing us that, and in LS10 up at the top are showing us that things are spreading slightly. But at least in those two examples, not at an alarming rate. The shaded pink area, if you sort of step back a bit and look at the big shaded pink area, the big pink egg in the middle of this plan, that was the extent of contamination of TCE at the time this map was drawn a couple of years ago. Based on the new results, you can see a slightly different set of red dashed lines that I put on this plan, showing a slight spread to the east and the north. I'm sorry, the west and the north. Over by Federal Street, it would appear that MW6 would not be included in the pink highlighted area anymore. So over by Federal Street, it shrunk a little bit, at least with the January sampling results. And other than that, I would say things have, in terms of the large outline, really haven't changed much. And that is probably due to the effect of the storm sewer acting as a collection entity for discharging groundwater and controlling contaminants as they leave the site. Doesn't answer the question of where they go once they get in the storm sewer, or indicate that that is an okay solution for the site. But it is protecting the homes on the south side of Kenwood Street in a fairly dramatic way. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be checking for indoor air and making sure that those homes are safe. It just means that the shallow groundwater, and this is a shallow groundwater map, indicates that that's as far as the contaminants go. If we get a bunch of deep monitoring wells, they could show, a deep monitoring well extent of contamination map would look totally different than this, I'm sure. Probably be a lot smaller, but it could also have a completely different shape, and who knows where it goes. Because in this map, we only have one data point, and that's in area A. Glenn, can you go to the one that shows the ball field on the west? Just scoop way over to the west, out Kenwood Street. Great, right there. Boop. So in addition to replacing well LS21 just above the label for Kenwood Street, OTO also installed a pair of monitoring wells over on the left side top of your current view, MWI and MWI deep. And both of those wells give groundwater results that are clean in terms of chlorinated solvents. And that's good news. It means that there's not a whole lot going on, at least in the center part of the ball fields. Results along the south side of Kenwood Street in monitoring wells and catch basins and along Forest Avenue are all quite clean. And that is good news for the neighborhood. Can you scoot down a little bit, Glenn?
Yeah, I can, I think I can.
There's a blue circle. There's
No,
a
I'll
new,
have to go back to the,
okay. There's a new monitoring well on Forest Avenue, closer to what would be a down gradient location from the Lunt property. That's also clean. So there you go. That's good. So you can see there's a number of monitoring wells along Forest Avenue. They were all sampled in 2013, 11 years ago. A new well, MWG, was installed right above the V and Avenue. And that well and the MW116 closest to it on Forest Avenue were both sampled in February, and they're both clean. So that's good news. And again, I'll just say all of these are shallow monitoring wells. And the only reason I'm stressing that is because the results in MWAD are quite high. So it begs the question, where did the stuff go? And that has not been answered in terms of a depth question. This is a three-dimensional, it's a three-dimensional site, largely controlled by groundwater flow direction, but not entirely. largely controlled by the storm sewer, but not entirely. And we have been OTO has been looking at this in a two-dimensional way for a very long time. And this is really the first three-dimensional view that we've had of the site. 2 deep wells. One's clean out by the ball fields, area A, not clean. And everything else is a question mark. I think that's all I wanted to say for now, Glenn.
I noticed up near the top in the middle, so on the north side of Kenwood, there is a catch basin sample that shows that there's a few up there that show that the TC contamination is still getting into the storm drain system.
Oh, it's definitely getting in the storm drain system. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
That is correct. On the north side of Kenwood.
Yes.
The south side seems pretty good. The only part of the south side of Kenwood that's still a question is MW 101. That has a fairly consistently high TCE concentration. And I don't know about the prior results in 2013 and 19. I didn't go back and look at those, but the one from this year has more than TCE in it, has other chlorinated solvents. I will note that MW9, that's just south of that in the blue highlighted lot, was sampled in 2013 and was not resampled. And the catch basin near MW 101 was sampled, but it had a really high detection limit. So they didn't detect at a level of 250, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot. Other than they didn't detect it at 250, but something happened with the sample and at the laboratory, and the detection limit wasn't able to be brought down low enough. So back to you, Glenn.
Lyons, is there anything more that you want to talk about before we go to questions?
No, I don't think so. Not tonight.
Okay. Glenn, could we go back to the gallery view? Okay. Are there questions? Matt, you're already there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just looking at I look at the lay of the land. I've lived here for 2.5 years, and I walk the neighborhood often, and I look at the lay of the land, see what goes on activity-wise. I've got a very active sump pump, and I'm on Norwood Street, directly across from, where the nice, pretty yellow showed up. So, but not just my own concern for myself and my wife and my neighbors, but for on the Norwood side of things, common sense says, well, water's going to flow downhill until you look underground and see that maybe there's ledge here and it drips off this way, then it heads north, maybe directing some of that flow in a northward way. And so would it be wise to put a couple of combination, and I don't know if one well is a deep well, one well is a shallow well. Is it possible to do some deep wells on Norwood, just on the west side, maybe 2 on the west side of Norwood Street, and closer to Lunt? And then is it worthwhile to check out the outflow of sump pumps? So it's 2 questions.
Sump pumps could be a media that sump pump effluent could be a media that was sampled. Yes.
Okay,
Is it? We'd have to see where it is, but that's certainly something that could be done.
Mhm.
The results at the deep well at MWA, we weren't provided a boring log for that well. That has not been provided yet.
Okay.
It would be interesting to see whether that well and the deep well in the ball field were drilled to bedrock, or were they just drilled to 25, 30 feet? And
Gotcha.
like, well, that's a deep well. Let's not go any further.
Right.
And if it didn't go to bedrock, then the question at area A is, how deep is bedrock? And then the question then becomes, well, okay, there's one data point. We have one data point now. We don't know if it's on bedrock or not. And so then the question becomes, what's the contour of the bedrock under the site? Because that could very well determine the direction of flow of the chlorinated solvents, the whole family of them.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So, yes, that's a good question. And I would think that deep wells up near Norwood Street would be helpful in determining, at least in a basic way, the contours of the bedrock.
Yeah, but there are a lot of kids that play on that Norwood. You've got 3 ball fields, and we've got the south side of the ball field. So I'd be curious about the north side, and then what do we got in between? And I mean, who knows?
Well, I will say that groundwater flow is from Norwood to Kenwood and then down to Forest in this neighborhood.
Right.
That's pretty well documented.
That's good.
And that, at least for near surface contamination, should control the flow of contaminants. And I think this map shows that pretty well. So I'm not terribly concerned about houses along Norwood or the surface of the ball field per se, based on these results. And even if there's deep contamination that's going toward Norwood, then that opens up a whole different set of questions. So let's just figure out if it's there before we get too far ahead.
Sure. Great.
Because even putting 5 or 6 deep wells on this property to get some idea of what the depth to bedrock is, and a few other sampling points for deep groundwater, that's going to be a big project.
Yeah.
But it will be an important one, and certainly one that would be a logical next step that comes out of this set of results.
Right. Great. Thanks, Lyons.
Norm.
Yeah, when I was on the council, we were told that most of this area was had a good size amount of clay to inhibit anything flowing in the ground. So whatever that's worth.
If that's true, then it will have an impact, or it could have an impact on how the contaminants flow. I see a deep well at A that has high levels of contaminants, and I don't have a boring log, so I can't tell you whether they ended on clay, if they ended on bedrock, or if they just got to 25, 30 feet and stopped. I don't know. If the folks at OTO want to chime in and provide a little more information about the deep well at MWA D, that would be helpful, but I don't know if they're prepared to do that. So,
Lyons, is it safe to say to the neighbors that at least as far as you know, the ball fields are reasonably safe for the kids to be playing on, and people's ability to be able to grow vegetables in their yards is also reasonably okay?
the ball fields are certainly, I would say, there's no reason that you shouldn't be, that anyone should be concerned about playing on the ball fields. When you start talking about people's yards, it totally depends which yard you're talking about. I don't see any surface contamination on any particular lot. But that's a lot by lot question, not a generic. I can't give you a generic answer on that.
Thanks. That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions that people have at this point? Okay, then let's move on to talk about where we're going.
Okay, next steps. So do you want me to continue, Susan?
Yes.
Yeah. So the first thing that we're thinking about doing is revising the public involvement plan, because we were back 2 years ago, we were very unhappy with that meeting, the first and only PIP meeting about discussing the draft plan. And then, of course, there has been no PIP implementation for 2 years. So we'd like to see the PIP plan revised. And in addition to that, we're currently working on a scope of work that got a conditional approval, but there were certain parts that were left out in the responses to DEP. So we'd like to see some revisions made to that. And then overall, we want this process to be accelerated as much as feasible, because like I said earlier, we're 14 years or 12 years along in the process, but we're stuck on year 2 of the actual cleanup timeline. So
can I just back up a minute on to the scope of work?
yeah, we'll have a slide about that.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. And then overall, our goal with all of these things is to better prepare for getting funding, because realistically, nothing is going to happen at this site without money. And that's just the bottom line. It's going to take a lot of money, and we're going to need to find that money in order to do a proper assessment and cleanup. So revising the PIP plan, that has already begun. Lyons has started working on that. Our goal is to better identify the community concerns and to actually conduct observations when field work is being done, and to split samples when that is occurring. And that will be written into the PIP plan. And then we also generally want to increase public involvement in this process to make sure that the public is involved in all stages of it, as the DEP regulations actually require, or at least provide. And so we want to alternate our meetings, hopefully with the city council. This kind of project is parked at the Economic Development Committee, subcommittee of the city council. And so I think we should have occasional meetings with the EDC council. And then we should also consider how to increase involvement, direct involvement with Mass DEP, because they have staff people that can be involved in this on a regular basis or an irregular basis. But other than the audit, they have not been involved in the PIP process. And then there's also a possibility to have some staff from EPA Region 1 involved in this as well. And then a question for our, for everyone to consider is, do we need to hire a professional facilitator as we go forward with meetings? So that's pretty self-explanatory. I'll go to the next slide, which is Lyons had a question about revising the scope of work. And these are some of the ideas that we have that have not been addressed right now in the conditionally approved scope of work. And that is doing a better test of the passive vapor barrier or vapor mitigation system under those buildings, and looking at converting those to active systems with a fan to create negative pressure, and then to actually test the air that's coming out of those vents to see if they contain TCE, what time of year they contain TCE, how much TCE vapor they contain, to better characterize if those systems are actually functioning. And there was a proposal in the scope of work to use ground penetrating radar, which is a surface system that looks down through the soil. And we know that historically there were some parts of the activities, the Silversmith activities that occurred out in the ball fields, but we don't know what the fate of those foundations, buildings, if any material they were used for storage. We don't know what material was stored out there. For instance, was TCE stored out there or other solvents? We don't have answers to those questions. And so we think it's appropriate to do some non-destructive sampling using ground penetrating radar to try to delineate any of the disturbed areas that may show remaining foundations, underground storage tanks, whatever that ground penetrating radar would show. And then if necessary, there can be more site investigation done just to preclude all possibilities of there being anything out there that we should be concerned about. And then we'd like to have what are called data loggers put into some of the monitoring wells so that we get a daily reading of the groundwater level in those wells. These are fairly inexpensive things that can be checked regularly. That information can be shared, and we can map those. There is about a 20-foot or more variation in the groundwater table surface at this site over the seasons. If you have an extremely wet year, there are pools, there are standing water in parts outside of the ball fields at this site where there is frozen water on the ground for a good part of the winter. Now, that may be due to confining layers or clay layers or other drainage problems, but it may also represent the actual water table. So by putting these data loggers in the wells, we'd be able to characterize the groundwater regime better at this site. And it's a pretty easy thing to do. It's pretty standard instead of doing it by a calendar, which means that you just sample essentially every 3 months or 4 months or whatever it is. The data loggers would give us a lot more data. And then we would also like to see the storm drain that is currently carrying TCE contaminated water. We'd like to see that characterized for the volume of water that storm drain is collecting and discharging. And we like to do a lot more sampling of that, especially during particularly high groundwater events or various times of the year. And that's where the data loggers would give us more information. But actually measuring the flow within that storm drain would also tell us what's the volume, how much contamination is leaving the site, and maybe give some indications of where is it going. And then we did talk about putting a well on the north side of Norwood. That's something we can discuss. And then Lyons talked quite a bit about additional deep monitoring wells to determine where these things that are called DNAPLs, the dense non-aqueous liquid phase materials, these chlorinated solvents that are heavier than water. Where are those? If there are pools of those occurring, where are they located? And that's something that we can require or request be incorporated into the revised scope of work. And Lyons, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you got it. Thanks.
Anybody have any questions that probably Lyons can answer and not me?
And you should
Before-
just shout them out since I can't see you all.
Yeah. We'll go on.
Okay.
As far as accelerating the cleanup timeline, what we would want to do is get what's called a preliminary phase 3 or an analysis of the potential treatment alternatives. There is a lot of information available. I mean, we are positive that there's TCE contamination at this site, that a lot of groundwater is contaminated. One of the estimates in the phase 2 comprehensive site assessment that was subject to the audit, there was a document included in that said that they estimated that there was at least 6 million gallons possibly of contaminated water underneath these buildings. And so we want to do some additional work on looking at those treatment alternatives, how to address this contamination, how to contain it, capture that besides letting it bleed off into the storm drains and go who knows where. And then what are the possible ways that it can be treated, either on-site, off-site, whatever. But that would be a preliminary phase 3. There were already 2 preliminary estimates done of that, one by Ty and Bond back in 2015. And then in the 2012 environmental site assessment that was done by OTO, they also included some preliminary treatment alternatives, very preliminary, but we'd like to expand on that work that was previously done. And the reason why we want to do that is we want to come up with some rough estimates for the treatment, containment, capture, treatment of this waste on the site, because we need to start looking for money. And the way to do that is to be able to make a very, strong, documented, scientific argument for why we need money when we apply for money in grant applications. So I'm just going to continue on unless somebody shouts out a question. All right. And the reason for really wanting to do all of this and have monthly meetings and prepare all of this information is that we want to find out who's going to pay for the cleanup. It should not be the taxpayers of Greenfield. This property, this, whatever you want to call it, this abandoned property that was given to the town, the deed was awarded to the town through bankruptcy. This contamination was not caused by the citizens of Greenfield, at least not the current citizens. And it seems very irresponsible of the city to spend a lot of money cleaning up a site like this when there should be federal and state monies available for this in this kind of situation where the town is completely not responsible for the contamination. So there are numerous avenues for trying to get funding. We already got a Mass DEP fund grant for technical assistance, and we applied and were awarded a second round of technical assistance grant funding for this site. And so the Lunt group will be continuing to work on this with these, with this small amount of money from that DEP is providing, but it is extremely helpful for this effort. It allowed the group to hire Lions. But there's an upcoming grant opportunity called the Multi-Use Assessment and Cleanup grant that the EPA will, the federal EPA will be announcing this fall. And so we want to do preliminary work to prepare ourselves to be able to submit a very competitive, very good grant application to ask for a large amount of money to help address the contamination, both the continued assessment, but then to begin the remediation process, the cleanup. And there are also other sources of funding on the EPA website, the Brownfields Grant Program. And these are live links in this. I did put the link to this document, a PDF of this show, in the chat. So you can explore those grant opportunities. And then there's also funding coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. And I don't know if it's, I mean, that's IRA, the IIJA. I don't know if it's how it's referred to in acronyms, but that is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the so-called infrastructure bill. And there are literally billions of dollars coming into various programs. And some of that money is going to go to EPA, and it's likely that some of it's coming to the state. And hopefully we will be able to find out how to tap into some of those funds that are coming from the federal government as they become available. There are things called earmarks, which we can work with our legislators to get specific allocations of funding through the state budgeting process, the legislative budgeting process. We can get actual earmarks that are targeted for the Lunt cleanup. We just have to work with our legislative delegation to do that. And then I have not looked into the last one, but there is a big pool of opioid settlement funding for addiction treatment. And since this is an addiction treatment facility, there may be enough of a connection with that kind of public health need that the state may have a certain percentage of this money that some of it can be acquired for addressing the contamination at this site to make sure that these folks that are being treated in a safe, uncontaminated environment while they're residents, for long time periods in this facility. So those are some of the ideas that we've come up with. There may be others, but what we want to do is position ourselves, gather a lot of information, and get ready to submit competitive requests for grant funding and other funding. Stay in very close touch with our legislators about this, both at the state and federal level. And I think we're getting down to the end of the presentation itself, but does anyone have any specific questions about funding? I cannot give you an estimate for how much this will cost because it is, again, very preliminary, but I can just say it's going to be a big ticket item. And I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, does anybody have any questions about where we are now and what the path forward looks like? The combination of the technical and also, the political and financial piece that we're going to have to do. Seeing none, Are there any other questions in regard to this whole thing right now? Or are people feeling like it's after 8 and we're starting to fade here, which is likely? Okay.
Well,
Glenn?
let me, Susan, let me
Go
just
ahead.
say that the goal going forward is to hold monthly meetings. We're going to
Right.
try to find a day, day of the month where that does not compete with city council or other meetings that are regularly scheduled. So we're going to work on that. As many as possible of these PIP meetings will be joint Board of Health meetings when 2 members of the board are available to attend them. And then we'll try to have occasional meetings as well with, or not in addition to, but at the same time, some of those monthly meetings can be with the Economic Development Committee, or at least we can invite them to the PIP meetings, however that might work. So tentatively going forward for the March meeting, we'd like to have a draft revised PIP plan and review that, and then start working on some revisions to the scope of work that can be submitted to DEP. And then in April, for the April meeting, we'd like to be able to accept the PIP plan and the revised scope of work, hopefully. And then in May, we'd like to start talking about the preliminary phase 3 treatment alternatives and try putting together some additional information about what that might look like, what some rough cost estimates would be. Again, preparing for being able to submit grant applications later that summer or in the fall. And then,
Could I ask a quick question? Sorry,
Absolutely.
I'm not trying to interrupt. Yeah.
nope,
So
Go
the
ahead.
PIP plan that you're talking about revising, whose responsibility is that? Is that your responsibility as the PIP group, or is that something that's on the city?
so as of tonight, the PIP implementation, the public involvement plan, has now been accepted by the Board of Health, and the Board of Health will be facilitating or implementing or making sure that that PIP plan is implemented and the things that are written in the plan are followed. So that is going to be a function of the Board of Health now. There has been nobody doing that for 2 years, but the board, the mayor requested that the Board of Health take that on, and the board met earlier tonight and agreed to do that. So going forward, the PIP will reside with the Board of Health.
Okay, so the revision, who wrote the original? Is that you guys?
No, that was there's a template that the DEP has on their website, and that process was turned over by the previous mayor to 401 Liberty, the tenant developer of the site, and they made some minor changes to the template, to the DEP template. I think the template is 12 pages. I think the PIP plan was 12 pages. I mean, they just changed a few words in it and submitted the template as the PIP plan. And so we will revise that plan over the course of the next couple of months so that it actually works for this site and this group and, this town,
Okay,
so that we can
understood. Yeah,
actually
that
have
makes
real
sense.
involvement by the public.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just finally, to your knowledge, has the city ever had to implement a PIP plan before?
I do not know that. It may have in the past. I don't know.
Okay, and how about yourself? Have you ever?
Have I ever been involved in a PIP plan?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Well, I admire. I'm a cancer survivor. I admire what you guys are doing. I also acknowledge that this sounds like a very complicated process. So let's give each other some grace, okay?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Yep. Thank you.
Devorah,
So I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
it's a little hard. Can you speak a little louder?
I will try. One question that came to mind is there is obviously a necessity to find out who and how many people are at that site. Would that be something that the Board of Health has somebody ascertain that? Is that something that this committee is now under the Board of Health. So I'm curious as to, I think that's an accelerated need that I see that Matt pointed out, is to find out who is there. So I'm wondering how that happens in the course of the steps going forward.
I suppose that I can try to answer that and say that as the chair of the Board of Health, I will make necessary attempts to contact people to try to get a better idea of the situation there. As I understand it, the Board of Health should be involved in all aspects of this project by statute or by regulation. There's a role for the Board of Health to play. And so, I'm not speaking for the Board of Health, but I'm speaking as the chair, that I believe that we will be more involved. We should be more involved. And I will make that effort to reach out to those folks and try to follow up on what you're talking about to build a better working relationship with people. Because again, we are all after the same thing, and that is to clean the site up and to make sure it's safe for the residents in the facility and for the neighborhood. We want to remove any of the concerns or address any of the concerns, and that's what
I get
that's
that.
what we intend to do.
Good, because I get that. I just wanted to find out under whose purview it is. So I hear it be under the Board of Health, and I hear that that will be something that you will look at sooner rather than later. That's all I want to hear. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
Are there any other questions or comments? I'm going to try to do just a quick overview summary, and then we can call this a day. Mary.
Yeah, I think I heard Devorah say that the PIP is under the Board of Health, or that this group is under the Board of Health, but the Lunt Neighborhood Action Group is not under the Board of Health. It's an independent citizen group. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, I agree with that. Let me make it clear that the PIP is not under the Board of Health. The Board of Health is the entity at the city level that is responsible or taking the responsibility to make sure that the PIP is being implemented properly. And, that's different than it being under. The PIP exists by regulatory decree in the DEP regulations. The PIP is an entity that exists because those group of people submitted the petition that created the PIP. It's separate from the Board of Health, but the Board of Health, the city is responsible for ensuring that public involvement plan be part of the process. And so now the Board of Health will be that entity that is responsible for making sure that the PIP is followed. We'll make every effort to do that.
PIP plan is followed.
The PIP plan is followed. Yeah.
There's a PIP group and a PIP plan in there.
They're different.
People are
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get this all right eventually, I think, now that we're
But
actually doing the work.
I want to make it clear that the Board of Health is not in charge of the PIP group and does not dictate to that PIP group in any way, but we are going to make sure that the city is performing an act of following through on its responsibilities to make sure that that public involvement plan is being implemented.
Okay, with that, any other questions or comments? I'm going to try to do a quick summary of the changes so that we can all, I think we can all be on the same page. I think the first thing is that as the discussion just occurred, that we now have a way to work with the city through the Board of Health that will move the process forward, and that we can go to the Board of Health with questions that we have or issues that we have that then can be followed through on in a way that we have not been able to do before. We also have funding for another year of Lyons's work as an LSP for the doing the independent work. So that will be available to us. So when we start talking about deeper wells, or we start talking about any of the various things that Glenn had put on the slide in terms of what the plan could look like, in terms of work that needs to be done, in the terms of the scope of work, we'll be able to, we have at least some funds. If we need more, we will then deal with that accordingly. We also have now, because the city is taking a proactive stance on this, we now have a way to go for funding through the city to be able to make sure that once we have a plan of what we need to do, we actually have the ability to be able to pay for it and have it happen. And we are going to have regular meetings. The plan is to have them monthly. We've got some work cut out for us in terms of a revised PIP plan, revisions to the scope of work, accepting those, and then going into what the treatment alternatives are that we need as a result of the work that Lyons is doing and the work of the Board of Health to follow up on that. Is that adequate and accurate?
Very good.
Okay. Okay, and with that, I am going to say that I bid everyone a good night. It's been a long meeting, but I think it was important that we have all of this information available to us and have the kind of history and process so we know where we've been and where we're going. And I look forward to seeing you and others who said they could not come this time at our next meeting in March rather, to be able to move this forward. And unless we've got anything more, we can end this recording and have you all spend the rest of your evenings doing something else that is probably more enjoyable. So I thank you all very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
On our way.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyons, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Glenn, can you end the recording, please?
Yep.